What if I told you that in exactly 47 minutes, everything you thought you knew about safety would shatter forever? What if the most ordinary Tuesday of your life became the day that divided your existence into before and after? This is Sarah's story, but it could be anyone's story. It could be yours. The fluorescent lights of Northwood High hummed their familiar soporific drone, a sound that had lulled thousands of students through countless ordinary days. But this Tuesday morning carried something different in the air, something imperceptible, something wrong. Sarah Chen had walked these same hallways for 2.5 years, a junior with calloused fingers from turning the pages of worn paperbacks. She had an unshakable aversion to calculus and a secret dream of writing novels that no one, not even her best friend Michael, knew about. She kept a journal hidden beneath her mattress, filled with fragments of stories about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. How could she have known she was about to live one? As she traced absent patterns on the frosted classroom window that Tuesday morning, watching the world outside blur into muted greens and grays, Sarah felt that peculiar sensation. You know the one. That prickle at the base of your skull when something isn't quite right, but you can't name what it is. Your body knows before your mind does. Evolution's warning system, still functioning after millions of years. She should have listened to it. The morning air in the school filled with the sound of morning chatter and lockers slamming, a typical day at Northwood High. The school was a typical American suburban school, red brick facade, built in 1987. Home to 1,200 students who believed themselves invincible in the way only teenagers can. The kind of place where the biggest drama was usually who was dating whom, or whether the football team would make it to state championships, where parents dropped off their children with casual, "have a good day" kisses, never imagining those might be their last words. The morning routine was as predictable as clockwork. First bell at 8:15 sharp, pulling students into their various academic orbits like planets around the sun. The halls filled with that particular symphony of adolescence, sneaker squeaks on linoleum, locker doors clanging, the rustle of papers, snippets of conversation about homework and weekend plans and who said what to whom. Mrs. Patricia Davison, a 52-year-old history teacher whose passion for ancient civilizations was genuinely infectious, began her second period lecture on the Roman Empire. She had been teaching for 23 years, had seen thousands of young faces pass through her classroom. Her voice carried that comfortable authority teachers develop, the rhythmic cadence that could make even the fall of empires feel like a bedtime story. The year was 476 CE, she began, writing the date on the whiteboard with practiced precision. And what the Romans didn't know was that their 1,000-year empire was about to collapse in a single day. Sarah sat in the third row, second seat from the window, her favorite spot, because she could gaze outside when Mrs. Davison's lectures became too much to absorb. But today something felt different. The usual pre-class chatter had been muted, subdued, as if the entire school was holding its breath. Michael Rodriguez sat beside her, his leg bouncing with that nervous energy that had earned him countless detentions over the years. But today, that restless motion had stopped. He sat unusually still, his dark eyes fixed on the classroom door with an intensity that made Sarah's skin prickle. It came during the discussion of Roman military tactics. A low thud, almost imperceptible, echoing from somewhere in the distant East Wing. Maybe the cafeteria, maybe the gymnasium. The kind of sound that could be anything. A dropped textbook, a fallen chair, someone moving furniture. A few heads turned, Sarah's included. Mrs. Davison paused mid-sentence, her chalk hovering over the board. For exactly 3 seconds, the classroom held its collective breath. Then life resumed. Because that's what we do, isn't it? We rationalize away the warning signs. We tell ourselves everything is fine because the alternative is too terrifying to consider. As I was saying, Mrs. Davison continued, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. By the time the second period was 15 minutes in, something had fundamentally changed in the atmosphere of Northwood High. If you had walked the hallways, which, thankfully, Sarah hadn't, you would have noticed the absence of something vital: joy. The easy laughter that typically echoed between classes had evaporated. The boisterous greetings, the casual shouts between friends, the comfortable chaos of adolescent social interaction, all of it had been replaced by hushed tones and sideways glances. Students moved more quickly between classes. Teachers lingered in their doorways, scanning the halls with expressions they couldn't quite name. Did you hear that earlier? Michael's voice was barely audible, his lips hardly moving. Sarah leaned closer. Hear what? That sound. It didn't sound right. What do you mean? Michael's hands were trembling slightly, something Sarah had never seen before, not even during his worst anxiety attacks. It sounded like... He paused, struggling for words. Like a fire alarm, but not quite. Like it was broken or far away. Sarah felt that prickle again, stronger now. The sensation when every primitive alarm in your nervous system starts screaming danger, but your rational mind keeps insisting everything is fine. A distant, distorted wail seemed to ripple through the very foundations of the school. It wasn't the piercing shriek of a fire alarm. Every student at Northwood knew that sound intimately from monthly drills. This was something more primal, more guttural. It was a scream, then another, and another. The classroom fell silent so abruptly it was as if someone had pressed a mute button on reality itself. 26 teenagers and 1 adult, all frozen in a moment of collective realization that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. Mrs. Davison's chalk slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. Her brow furrowed with concern. Not yet fear, not quite, but something deeper than mere worry. Her hand moved toward the door, then hesitated. "Stay calm, everyone," she instructed, but her voice betrayed a tremor that made every student's blood run cold. It's probably just a drill, but her eyes, wide and searching, darting between the door and the windows and back again, told a different story entirely. The thudding of something getting closer began to build in the hallway. The thudding returned, and this time there was no mistaking it for dropped textbooks or moving furniture. It was rhythmic, purposeful, and it was accompanied by the distinctive cacophony of shattering glass and panicked shouts echoing through the hallways. The illusion of safety, that carefully constructed belief that schools are sanctuaries, that violence happens to other people in other places, crumbled in an instant. Like a house of cards in a hurricane, everything they thought they knew about their world collapsed. Mrs. Davison moved with sudden, decisive action. She yanked the door shut with a bang that made everyone jump, then turned the lock with a frantic click that sounded like a death knell in the silence. Get under your desks! Now! The command cut through their paralysis like a blade. 26 teenagers scrambled in pure panic. A tangle of limbs and tearful glances, seeking refuge beneath wooden surfaces that suddenly seemed as flimsy as paper. Sarah's desk, which had held her books and dreams for 2.5 years, now felt like her only protection against the unthinkable. The sounds from the hallway were crystal clear now, each one a nail in the coffin of their innocence. Gunshots fired in a rapid-fire succession, closer screaming followed by heavy footsteps. The guttural roar of a male voice shouting commands they couldn't quite make out. The desperate pleas that were abruptly, sickeningly cut short. Sarah huddled beneath her desk, knees drawn to her chest, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The air had become thick, not just with fear, but with something metallic and sharp that caught in the back of her throat. The taste of terror, she would later realize, a flavor she would never completely forget. She could hear Michael beside her, whimpering so softly it was almost inaudible. His usual nervous energy had transformed into something else entirely, a trembling so violent she could feel it through the floor. Her mind, in a desperate attempt at self-preservation, began conjuring impossible explanations. A movie filming, an incredibly elaborate prank, a misunderstanding. Anything but the unthinkable reality unfolding just yards away from where she crouched. But reality has a way of asserting itself, doesn't it? A cold, hard fist that punches through even our most creative delusions. Suddenly, a deafening bang rattled their classroom door. The bang that rattled their classroom door wasn't just loud, it was apocalyptic. The wooden frame groaned and splintered, pieces flying across the room like shrapnel. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut so tightly she saw stars, pressing her hands against her ears as if she could somehow muffle the sounds of her own impending doom. The rhythmic banging continued, again and again and again. Each impact sent vibrations through the floor, through the desks, through their bodies. The door, solid wood, metal hinges, a barrier that had seemed so permanent, was failing fast. The screams from the hallway had begun to dwindle, replaced by something infinitely more terrifying. An eerie, unsettling quiet, broken only by the sporadic crack of gunfire and the chilling sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate. The footsteps were pacing just outside their door like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. Every creak of the floorboards became a countdown. Every whispered breath, every stifled sob from her classmates amplified into a terrifying symphony of dread. Sarah had never understood the phrase deafening silence until that moment. The quiet was louder than any scream. Mrs. Davison incredibly maintained her composure. She crouched behind her desk, holding a heavy textbook, world history, ancient civilizations to modern times, as if its 800 pages could somehow shield them from bullets. Her eyes darted constantly between the splintering door and her terrified students, a mother hen protecting her chicks from a wolf. The clock on the wall was emphasized, ticking louder. Minutes stretched into geological eras. Each second was a lifetime. Sarah found herself counting her heartbeats. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rhythm keeping her anchored to reality when everything else felt like a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. She thought about her parents. Her father, probably reviewing contracts in his law office, completely unaware that his daughter was crouched under a desk, praying for her life. Her mother, likely grading papers in her own classroom across town, checking the clock and wondering what to make for dinner. Would she ever see them again? Then, cutting through the silence like a knife through silk, came a voice that would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come. "I know you're in there." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs with such force, she was certain everyone could hear it. The sound seemed impossibly loud in her ears. A frantic bird trapped in a cage, beating its wings against the bars in desperate, futile hope. The voice had been low and gravelly, carrying a casual tone that was somehow more terrifying than if he had been screaming. It was the voice of someone in complete control, someone who knew exactly what he was doing and was in no hurry to do it. The doorknob rattled once, twice, then twisted with a metallic scrape that sent shivers down every spine in the room. A collective gasp rose from the students, 26 sharp intakes of breath that sounded like a single, shared sob. The lock held, for now. Heavy impact sounds resumed, more violent this time, relentless. Each impact sent another crack spiderwebbing across the door's surface. Through the widening fissure, Sarah caught a fleeting glimpse of dark clothing and something that caught the fluorescent light. A metallic glint that made her stomach drop into free fall. Time became fluid, meaningless. Was it minutes? Hours? The clock on the wall had become an enemy, its hands moving with cruel slowness. Each tick was another moment of terror, another second of not knowing if it would be their last. Sarah's mind began to fracture under the pressure, whispering her thoughts to herself. She found herself thinking about absurd things. Whether she had turned in her English essay, whether Michael had ever worked up the courage to ask Jessica to the spring formal, whether her library books were overdue. The human brain's attempt to maintain normalcy in the face of the unthinkable. She thought about her journal hidden under her mattress, filled with stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. How naive those stories seemed now. How sanitized. How completely inadequate they were to capture the raw, animalistic terror of knowing you might die at any moment. But then, a new sound came, and it was the most beautiful thing Sarah had ever heard. A distant siren. The sirens grew steadily louder. Not one siren, many. A symphony of salvation approaching through the morning air. The thudding at the door faltered, then stopped entirely. The footsteps, those deliberate, predatory footsteps, receded down the hallway. The sirens grew louder, more urgent. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but the wail of approaching sirens and the ragged breathing of 26 terrified students and one teacher who had somehow managed to keep them all alive. Mrs. Davison remained frozen for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Her body was rigid with tension, every muscle coiled like a spring. Finally, slowly, cautiously, she pushed herself up from behind her desk. She moved to the door with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb, each step deliberate and silent. She peered through the largest crack, her body positioned to shield her students from whatever she might see. "It's clear," she whispered, her voice hoarse with emotion and barely recognizable. I think it's over." Movement followed, chairs scraping and muffled sobs of relief. But for Sarah, and for all the survivors of Northwood High, this wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of a different kind of terror, one that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The aftermath was a landscape of shattered glass and overturned desks, scattered papers and crimson stains that janitors would spend days trying to scrub away. The once vibrant hallways had become an echoing tomb, each corner holding ghostly memories of laughter that would never return. Muffled sounds of emergency responders and radio chatter filled the school as Sarah emerged from beneath her desk on legs that felt like water. The classroom looked like a war zone, chairs overturned, papers scattered, the door hanging from its hinges like a broken promise of security. Through the windows, she could see police cars and ambulances, arriving in a chaos of flashing lights and urgent voices. She saw Michael being pulled into his mother's arms, both of them sobbing with relief and trauma. She saw other classmates, their faces pale and tear-streaked, their eyes holding that 1,000-yard stare she had only seen in war movies. The memory of those 47 minutes would forever be etched into Sarah's mind with the precision of acid on metal, the sound of gunshots, the screams that stopped too suddenly, the weight of waiting under a desk, not knowing if she would live to see another day. The silence of the school, once a comfort during study periods, now carried the echo of violence. The metallic taste of fear would linger in her subconscious like a permanent stain. The fluorescent lights would never again hum innocently overhead. Reflective music began to play. Life after Northwood became a careful navigation through a world that felt perpetually unsafe. Sleep was elusive, haunted by nightmares that replayed the horror with vivid, relentless precision. The sound of a car backfiring could send Sarah into a spiral of panic. A door slamming in a hallway could trigger flashbacks so vivid she could smell the fear sweat and hear Michael's whimpers all over again. The safe haven of school, that fundamental assumption of childhood, had been irrevocably shattered, replaced by a landscape of metal detectors and armed guards, of lockdown drills that felt less like preparation and more like trauma reenactment. News clips of other schools fading in and out showed years past, and Sarah learned to function in a world that felt fundamentally changed. She saw the news reports about other schools, other communities shattered by similar violence. She felt a profound, unspoken kinship with other survivors, a shared understanding that could never be explained to those who hadn't lived through it. The monster that had stalked the halls of Northwood High was eventually caught, tried, and imprisoned. But his shadow stretched long and dark across the lives of everyone who survived that Tuesday. Some moved away, seeking fresh starts in places where school bells didn't trigger panic attacks. Others, like Sarah, stayed and learned to carry their invisible wounds like permanent scars. In a quiet, contemplative tone, Sarah did eventually write her novel. It wasn't about ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. She had learned that such circumstances aren't extraordinary at all, but terrifyingly, numbingly ordinary. Instead, she wrote about the after, about the long, difficult work of rebuilding a sense of safety in a world that had proven itself fundamentally unsafe. But even now, 15 years later, certain sounds can transport her back to that classroom in an instant. The hum of fluorescent lights, the scent of rain on morning air, the casual laughter of students who still believe themselves invincible. They would never be truly ordinary sounds again. The memory of that Tuesday lives in her bones. A silent scream, a chilling testament to how quickly everything can change, how fragile our sense of security really is, and how the worst moments of our lives can occur on the most ordinary of days. Sometimes, late at night, Sarah still wonders, What if the sirens had arrived 5 minutes later? What if the lock had failed? What if Mrs. Davison hadn't acted so quickly? These are the questions that survivors carry. Not just the memory of what happened, but the weight of what almost happened, and the knowledge that somewhere, in some other school, on some other ordinary Tuesday, the sirens might not arrive in time.